This tear shouldn't be a problem.
We're gonna start by cutting our foam.
I cut my walls to 3/8 of an inch thick, but they will end up being 1/2 inch thick once we add our base. Now, I'm using these dimensions to make this as modular terrain, but you are more than welcome to make scatter terrain or a whole temple build, in which case your measurements can be a lot more approximate. I personally like this modular system because storage. If you are magnetizing, once you've cut as many pieces as you like, you can facilitate marking all your magnet holes by stacking your cut pieces together and using a ruler or two to measure the appropriate placements. Then you can actually place your magnets according to the diagram, either now or sometime before painting. Note that I've changed the magnet orientation from my previous wall video to have north-south, north-south, rather than the north-north, south-south, because now I can do this. And again, full credit for this magnet system to RP Archive. I will link his video in the description where you can get more detailed instructions on how to implement it. Now, turning to my very main source of inspiration, I've decided to go for a monumental aesthetic with large stone slabs, which I carve in 2 rows per wall. I start by choosing a top side and marking the horizontal split using my Proxon 7/8 of an inch from the top on both sides. And because I'm unnecessarily detail oriented, I shaved down all the corner edges so that the stones look rounded and therefore more worn down. I will label these as UDO tips. They are optional for your sanity. Then I use an X-Acto knife to cut the vertical lines, making 3 to 4 slabs per row for the longer walls and 2 for the shorter walls. I also put these little bricks in every couple of walls because I did my best to mirror the same brick shapes on both sides. Then carve away to the extent that you want these walls to look time and weather worn. Use a variety of tactics, from carving a crack through the brick to shaving down and picking away at whole chunks to reveal the inner layer of the slab. I actually learned from one of my patrons that often old temples were made with a cheaper, sturdier core rock material and then a brittle outer material because it held carved details better. Once you're happy with your carving, take a well-textured rock and bash away. I use rocks rather than tinfoil because I find it leaves a deeper impression. And then after that, emphasize any of your cuts by running a ballpoint pen or clay tool directly through them. I like to do this part after the stamping because I find that when you texture with a rock afterwards, it tends to close up those channels. So again, UDO tip here, use something slim like a ballpoint pen and then something a bit larger to open up and round off the bricks. Even better, use your glue gun to melt, round off, and harden the edges of the bricks. Just be aware that it can make some of these parts hydrophobic, so that'll just mean more paint layers later on. But you be the gauge of what is good versus good enough for your purposes. Now, you may be thinking that these walls are simply too skinny, and you'd be right. I've personally made them this way because they're meant to be visual cues for where barriers are, but if you would like them to be climbable or more realistic, then you are more than welcome to make them thicker. Once the walls are textured, we cut thin strips for the bases. Bash these as well and then glue down. I use tacky glue for a better hold for these, doing both sides and then gently pushing down on the table with the wall upright to make sure it's all lined up at the bottom. Once it's all dry, you can trim off any excess that may be sticking out from the edges. Now put all of that out of your brain so that we can make something similar but very different. For this, you'll need strips of foam that are 1/4 inch tall, 3 3/4 inches long, and 1/2 inch deep, which I've already stamped on the shorter side here. You'll also need bricks. These are going to be our building blocks for our crumbled wall bits. By the way, if all these measurements seem like a lot to remember, head on over to my Patreon page where I've uploaded a Google Sheets as a list to reorganize all this information. I'll continue to add helpful things on there with feedback from you guys, as well as references to other things I've mentioned like grid size, magnet placements, etc. Anyway, I start by picking various bricks and placing them how I like, choosing one side to be flush and one side that tapers off towards rubble. I then take the brick chunks and carve and pick away to reveal that core layer, especially towards the side that's closer to the rubble, to really emphasize the erosion that would likely have taken place there. I try not to do too much damage to the side that needs to align with the other walls though, to help things line up better. And once everything is textured, I glue the pieces in place, starting with the flush side. I just use hot glue mainly because I'm impatient. To press in place, I found it helpful to line it up against something 90 degrees to keep that straight wall. The rest of the pieces can be as askew or wobbly as you want. For final touches, you can carve out chunks of the base and even rip parts of the tapered end off. I made some 3-length walls and 2-length walls. To make sure these work with any of our other walls, instead of using a magnet, I put a small nail where the magnet would be, with just a bit of hot glue to seal it before pushing it all the way in. Once you're satisfied with your walls, we can go to our columns and arches. For the columns, I wanted something to stick out a bit from the walls, so I cut a bunch of 5/8 by 5/8 by 1/2 inch cubes. That are technically not cubes, but we're gonna ignore that. Once again, UDO took over and I shaved all the edges before bashing. You could not care about the corners and do the shake them in a container with a bunch of rocks method, or, hear me out, do it my way and take thrice the amount of time. Your choice. I then lined 4 of them up in a box for a nice 90-degree corner and hot glued them one by one. This will help if your cuts weren't exactly square or they've been quite bashed out of shape. UDO, if they're a bit shorter than 2 inches altogether, don't smush them so much when gluing. If they're taller than 2 inches, just shave a bit afterwards. Then, keeping track of the corner you aligned with the box, mark your magnet placements. I used RP Archive's idea to put 2 magnets facing north on one side and 2 magnets facing south on the other. This way you can switch them to whatever orientation you need, including upside down to go with the upside down walls. Instead of magnets on the top and bottom, I melt and place a square of nickel. I don't need these to stick to each other, but if we do in the future, we'll deal with it then. For now, this will allow the columns to magnetize to the arches. Also, I decided I wanted the rubble walls to be more stable in case they sit on top of walls and don't have anything else to attach them, so I put a square of nickel at the bottom of these as well. Good enough. For the arches, I made this template that you can download and print to use with your Proxon or hot wire cutter. I made a version for both a 1-inch grid and a 1 1/4 inch grid for regular sized and grander sized doorways. To use, first print and cut 2 copies of this template and pick a piece of foam that the template fits on. Cut the foam to the desired depth, in my case 5/8 of an inch, to match my columns. Tape 1 template on the back and 1 on the front, making sure they line up to ruins side and out. Having a flat edge will also make them easier to line up. Then hot wire away. Again, using the lowest setting that you can get away with so that you can trace carefully without overly melting any one spot on the foam. Also, use gentle pressure against the wire to keep it flush with both the front and back templates as you trace around. Then, before you peel off the template, mark on one side, on both the inside and outside, small notches where the stone breaks will be. Then you can remove the template and use the notches to guide your hot wire along the inside and outside of the arch and connect the breaks on the front and back with an X-Acto knife. The texturing here is very much like what we've already done. I just use the edge of the table or another stone to support the arch as I bash the outside. For magnets, I place one magnet on each end with the south side facing down. For painting, we're going to start with a classic slather of half matte Mod Podge, half tan paint. I did probably 3 layers of this, each layer putting progressively more paint in the mix than Mod Podge in order to kill that sheen that matte Mod Podge still leaves. Make sure your layers are caked on. UDO tip, I pull the paint mixture in the magnet holes to make it look more flush and to quiet the anxious thoughts in my brain that keep me up at night about how if I don't do this, then that'll be the tipping point and a magnet will rip out, and if I just pulled the paint, then it would have prevented that. Or, you know, take a deep breath and don't do that. Once that's dry, we go to coat everything in a brown wash to emphasize the cracks in our work. This time around, I just used 1 part burnt umber acrylic ink mixed with 4 parts water. I gently brush this on one side to start, making sure I get every crevice. Then I take a sheet of paper towel and dab the wall against it a few times. And to get everything evenly, I put the wall on the paper towel and gently press down while dragging the paper towel over my cutting mat in order to hit the space just above the base of the wall. I do this 2 or 3 times to avoid getting the paper towel pattern transferred on the wall, and I also wipe off the sides and corners so it doesn't get too dark from any ink overlapping. Then I do the sides, tops, and bottoms, dabbing gently on the paper towel and wiping the corners in case any ink pools over the sides. The process is very similar for the columns and arches. For the columns, I coat all 4 sides and then dab each side, rolling over on the paper towel to catch the edges. Let dry, then do a light pass and dab on the tops and bottoms. For the arches, I coat whatever parts I can while holding it. Then once dry, do the parts I was holding and the bottoms. Next, I dry brush everything in a coat of just tan to bring back some of the highlights without making any edges look hard by using too light of a color. And hey, we're not done yet. Okay, dry brushing isn't always the last step. In order to emphasize that core layer on whichever pieces you've carved chunks away for, I did 1 more wash, just in those recessed areas. This time with 1 part red paint, 1 part burnt umber ink, and like 5 or 6 parts water. I just wanted to give this layer a tint of something a little redder, a little darker to differentiate from the outer layer. And now we're done, okay, you can go. Check out my Patreon, bye!